Hi everyone, I'm Georgia from Brunswick Bound, and I'm joined by Victoria Hannan, an amazing author whose debut novel Kokomo came out last year. I'd like to acknowledge that both myself and Victoria are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our deep respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that to any First Nations people who are watching this broadcast. To introduce Victoria, she is a writer and photographer based in Melbourne. Kokomo won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an Unpublished Manuscript back in 2019, which is a huge achievement. Her writing has also appeared in McSweeney's Internet Tendency and Subbed In. As for the novel itself, which is one of my favourites from last year, Kokomo is both hilarious and heartbreaking. It's an unflinchingly candid novel about grief, family, love, desire, unreliable histories, and regret. Propelled with vivid, visceral craft and millennial humour and honesty, the novel sees 29-year-old Mina make an emergency return to her old home in Melbourne after her mother is seen outside of her house for the first time in 12 years. Mina left Australia for London 7 years prior, but what unfolds through her trip home forces her to confront all of her relationships, her idea of the past and of her mum, and the shifting nature of truth. So that's my introduction to the novel, but I think there's no better way than to pass over to you, Vic, to read a little bit from Kokomo.
Yeah, I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 12, and slight spoiler alert for those who haven't read it, this is from Elaine's point of view. The green striped wallpaper, the blood red wood, it made Elaine feel glamorous. She sat at the bar atop a high leather stool, her legs too short to reach the floor, the low heels of her shoes clanking against the metal bar as she swung her feet nervously. If he comes, it means something, she thought. It means love, or at least the promise of it. Please come, she begged silently. Please come, please come, please come. She stared at the row of taps and read the names of the beers she'd never heard of, some she'd seen ads for. The tall, bald bartender pulled a pint for a man standing at the end of the bar. It looked black, thick like gutter water with an off-milk froth. Behind the bar were rows of spirits in bottles. She recognised two of them, the brandy her mum drank a small glass of every Saturday night, two on Christmas Day, the whiskey her dad brought out at the end of the dinner where she and Bill had announced their engagement, a glass for him and a glass for Bill. The barman approached her. Elaine noticed that his eyes were the same green as the wallpaper, the same green as the carpet. She wondered if they were always that colour or if they'd changed gradually since he started working there. She didn't know if this was even a thing the body could do. She was only just learning the magic her body was capable of. At this point, it felt like anything was possible. "What'll it be, love?" he asked, an English accent buried deep in there somewhere. She felt her face flush. "A small glass of Carlton Draft," she said so tentatively it was almost a whisper. It was the beer on a billboard she'd seen from the tram. She knew the suburb. She and Bill had eaten in an Italian restaurant there once. "A pot of Carlton it is." The bartender pulled a glass from under the bar, cocked it on an angle and poured the beer. She looked around the bar. It was a festival of men in there, men laughing, talking, their voices like far-off traffic. There were familiar men, bankers, insurance men, all too much like Bill. She knew she'd picked the wrong kind of place. "It's close to your work," she'd told him. "Just come for 10 minutes. Just come," she'd begged him. "Please come, please come." In the 24 hours since asking and her dangling her feet nervously from the high stool, Elaine had rewritten her whole future, a frenzied imagining of a new life. She saw beauty previously where there'd been little. The way the sun shone through the blinds in the morning, fractured light fanned in beams, the colours of the rainbow lorikeets that sang and danced in the gums. Everything seemed more magical to her, more colourful, more real, more true, more alive. "That'll be $1.50, the barman said, and Elaine found the change in her purse, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she passed it over. She looked at the amber liquid. It fizzed and bubbled, the sweating glass crowned by a small white head. She took a sip and it tasted bitter but not bad. She took another and she liked it more. She waited. Every time the door opened, her heart would split wider and wider, a volcanic fissure, a rift valley. She'd crane her neck, hoping it was him, but each time she saw another man in a suit. Not him, not yet. Soon, though, soon. The longer she waited, the more time she had to inflate what his coming or not coming would mean. Her heart growing like rising dough. Please come, please come. Her beer was warm, mostly just froth by the time he slipped through the door. He wore a blue jacket, jeans. He'd not yet changed into his work uniform. Her whole body stiffened at the sight of him, his black hair, big eyes. She didn't think she'd ever seen someone so beautiful, so perfect. And here he was for her. He saw her and walked to her with his head down. He seemed to be shrinking himself so as not to be seen, but she saw him. She couldn't believe he'd come.
Thank you so much. It's so beautifully written and read.
Oh, thank you.
It's funny, that was what I just reread yesterday, that exact part, so that's quite uncanny. It kind of leads to a question I had a little bit further down the line, but on love and on the nature of love. And with Elaine's story, I found it quite almost confronting, but really fascinated. I was really fascinated to read, like, both Mina does this with the character of Jack, but also, Elaine's background around like the complexity of desire, sort of unrequited or requited, if it's reciprocal, if it's not. And I guess having seen an experience like that intensity of obsession, I wanted to ask you about what your thoughts on this kind of level of desire is, like, and if you think it's delusional, mutual, or otherwise, or
I think for Elaine, and for Mina too, with her experience with Jack, I think part of it is delusion, but then part of it is also that the men have kind of dangled carrots in front of them. And I mean, I don't know if we should talk about the person in particular that we are speaking about with Elaine, because I don't want to ruin the surprise for people. But I feel like both of the experiences that Mina and Elaine have are sort of mirrored, in that these men are just like kind of bringing them along for the ride without ever fully committing to them. And so they are slightly delusional and they are very obsessed, but potentially it's not unwarranted. And I think on both parts, for Mina and Elaine, it is reciprocated in a way, but just not to the level that both of the women are feeling. So I think they're sort of led down a path and then abandoned there by the men. And I wanted to show the differences in the generations with that obsession and how that plays out. So I think Mina is just as obsessed with Jack as Elaine is with the man that she's in love with. But with Mina, it's so much easier for her to kind of explore that obsession without looking like a crazy person. So she sits at home and she's able to kind of monitor where Jack is at all times based on his social media activity. Whereas with Elaine, this is kind of the 80s. And so she didn't have that kind of access to this man. And so she ends up going to his workplace and then at one point going a little too far and following him home, and then going even further and moving to the street where he lives. And so I think it's actually a very similar level of obsession that they share, but one is just easier to do in the modern world and to kind of explore in the modern world than the other.
And I guess in Elaine's case, it's sort of the 80s version of cyber stalking, right? Like,
exactly.
Yeah. I might jump then in that case to also social media then, because it comes up a lot in your novel. And it's definitely changed as the global pandemics come out now, and our reliance on it has increased more than ever. But in Kokomo, it seems like, and quite rightly so, it's sort of another metaphor on the kind of Kokomo title, of like social media being this really misleading mirage. And with her, as in Mina's experience of it, it's not great for the most part, right? But it does kind of force her to remain more strongly connected to her past than would have otherwise happened in, say, the 80s or 90s, while she's in London. And yeah, I wanted to know what you sort of think about this sort of almost like forced or constant connectivity that we have, even though like the medium of that connection is by and large quite superficial on the social media platforms and things.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's wonderful. I lived overseas I was in the UK for almost 10 years. And as social media kind of came into being, it made it so much easier to get in touch and stay in touch with people. And when you're trying to establish a life in one country, it can be very hard to maintain those bonds and those friendships with people in other countries. And social media does make you feel like you're still a part of people's lives, even if you are just seeing the version of their lives which they want you to see. But also, you know, I have friends in the UK who have kids, and I get to see those kids growing up in ways that I wouldn't be able to if social media didn't exist. So in some ways it's an incredibly powerful tool, and particularly in a time when we can't travel and we can't go and see people. It's a great way to kind of stay in each other's lives. But then there is the downside of just looking at these lives that people have, and everyone just looks like they're having a fine time, and that the pandemic hasn't touched them at all, and they're doing really well, and just, you know, living their best life despite the fact that everything is terrible. And so I think I definitely found that pretty hard during the pandemic. And also I don't know if anyone else has felt this, but I would see people overseas, particularly in the UK, like going on European holidays while there's a global pandemic, and I felt so gaslit by it because I was stuck in my house. And I was like, am I crazy for feeling so worried about this when people over there are like traveling to Iceland? But now they're all in a bit of a mess. So maybe we were right to kind of be locked down and to be worried. But yeah, there's definitely that side of social media where you're looking at other people's perfect lives and feeling bad about your own. But I mean, I'm as guilty of it as anybody, where I generally just post pictures when I'm having a nice time. So
yeah, and I guess like with social media, we either opt in or out of, like, even if you choose to put on more of the personal stuff that isn't so positive seeming, it's quite exposing to like a huge audience that you might not necessarily want to be sharing that with as well. This kind of brings me, I guess, to like talking about one of the main themes of your novel more publicly, and that's grief. And I read this quote recently on grief that, you know, just says, grief is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. Grief is just love with no place to go. And I was thinking of this in terms of with Mina and her mum Elaine, and they kind of like failures of communication, this kind of cycle of grief that's shared between mother and daughter. But because so much of it goes unspoken or isn't spoken about, it worsens the situation, and especially around, you know, death, right? And this made me think of how resistant we are to speaking about grief more publicly. And I don't necessarily mean just on social media, like even just interpersonally, you know, with friends or colleagues or whatever, as though it's an expectation. And yeah, I was wondering why you think that is.
I think grief scares people. I think part of it is that they don't want to imagine that a death or something tragic could happen to them. And so by leaning into grief and talking about grief, they sort of have to start to think about their own mortality and the mortality of others around them. And they just don't want to put themselves into that position. But one thing that I have learned the hard way is that grief is coming for all of us. There is absolutely if you love anybody, there is no avoiding grief at all. And I have to say, I was really inspired a few years ago by a friend of mine who lost her husband to cancer, and she used social media as an outlet to talk about grief very openly, and she would post selfies of herself every day as part of her grieving process, even if she looked terrible and felt terrible. And I've never seen anybody kind of lean into grief and talk about it so openly And I didn't know her that well at the time, and it actually really made me want to get closer to her and to talk to her more about it. And I think that probably, and the way that she did that really opened up a lot of people around her to having a kind of a more open and honest dialogue about grief and the different ways that it can affect you. And I have since learned that it's not a thing that we should run away from, because like I said, it is coming for all of us, and the more we know about it, the better we're going to be at it. And I feel like because of my friend Sophie and the way that she kind of opened up about grief, and also all of the reading that I did and the writing that I did on grief in this book, it made me much more aware of my own grief recently when my mother passed away, and kind of my ability to understand what I was feeling and the way that other people were feeling around me. And I was able to kind of have more open and honest conversations with my family about the ways that we were feeling. So I think it's so important to just help you heal. And, you know, grief, it's a long, very long process, and I don't know if we ever get over the loss of someone that we love. But at least we can kind of absorb it better and kind of learn how to live with it day to day by talking about it.
Absolutely. And yeah, that was when you're talking about your friend Sophie, I just think, wow, yes, that's so brave, but it's also so giving, because yeah, when you find yourself suddenly in the grief space, relatable content and relatable discussions around it, yeah, it's crucial. Yeah,
I'm sure there were some people who were scared off by it and probably found it a little too terrifying. And I always feel like there's one thing that a lot of people will say to you when you've been through something traumatic or when you are grieving, where they'll say, I just can't imagine what you're going through. And it's like, well, maybe you should try. Like, it's not fun, but you're going to be in this position one day, and by having empathy and trying to imagine what this feels like now, it's going to help you a lot more in the future.
And also, I guess, how to even talk to somebody who, you know, is going through that too, right?
I think people are always scared of saying the wrong thing, and so often they'll find it's easier to say nothing at all. And I think with the Mina and Elaine relationship, Mina had no idea how to talk to her mum, and Elaine had no idea how to talk to her daughter, and so it just ended up with both of them having these walls up for a really long time, and it almost ruined their relationship.
Yeah, and both invented different stories that just weren't true from that too as well.
What is one of the things that I really wanted to explore, this idea that when you are just kind of, you know, neck deep in your own grief, it's really hard to see other people, and you can quite easily forget that other people are struggling as well. And so I think for both Mina and Elaine, they were both just like in these holes where they were unable to see anybody around them. They were just feeling their own feelings and creating their own stories as to why things were happening without actually talking to each other.
Yeah, and we do that very easily when we don't actually speak directly to each other, right?
Well, it's easier to believe the story that you tell yourself than it is to actually find out the truth sometimes, I think.
Absolutely. I'm going to jump to a bit of a slightly cliche writer question, but I am really curious about this actually, because this is your first novel, and I found like your writing style, it's really passionate, it's really interrogative, like it kind of moves like a wave being caught in it, and yeah, it's really incredible. So I was wondering what sort of writing you normally like to read, or if there's any like works of literature that you really come back to again and again.
I try to read a lot and quite widely. I think in the first year, so the first year that I was working on Kokomo, I think I read 100 books that year.
Wow.
I really tried to just kind of read as much as I could. And that definitely, I mean, it is such a cliche, but reading as much as you can and reading widely just makes you a better writer. There's no question about that at all. And it really can also teach you all the different ways that a story can be told. And so while this is the first novel that I have published, I had written 3 before this that were all just awful, truly, truly terrible. And that's just not me being a typical writer, just being self-deprecating. They were truly awful. But I think I just needed to do some practice and try and work out how to write. And I think the sort of education that I had was very stuck in this quite traditional way of doing things. And I sort of had this idea of how you should write and how a story should be told. But through reading widely, I was able to see just all the different ways that it's possible. And I think I really found my voice in that year and the sort of 2 years that I was working on Kokomo after that. But I think one book that I keep coming back to and that I read a lot during the writing of this book was the Deborah Levy, the first book in the series of her kind of living autobiography. And the name is, I've got 2 copies in this room and the name of it is escaping me at the moment.
I should know it off the top of my head.
It's the orange one.
The orange one, yeah. And
the cost of living. It's the cost of living.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I gave that to my mum, yeah.
I've given that to so many people. I love that book so much. And I'm really excited about the 3rd installment of that coming out later this year. But there was just something about the honesty of her storytelling in that book. And just, I don't know, it spoke to me in so many ways because she's writing about grief and she's writing about the dying of her mother and the breakup of her marriage, and there's just a vulnerability to it, but also just like a fearlessness in the way that she writes, which I found really inspiring and beautiful.
Fantastic. And yeah, I would definitely agree that, yeah, you've found your voice and it's very, very strong. So it's really enjoyable to read. I guess
you would think otherwise if you read any of those earlier manuscripts.
That too is reassuring though, because and you know, I'm a writer and I'm hoping that there are other writers who are watching this as well to kind of hear that from someone who, you know, has won the VPLA and, you know, has a really successful, fantastic published book. Like, yeah, sort of dust yourself off and try again.
Yeah, just keep going. Keep going.
In terms of process, what I really admire about this novel is like so much information is withheld. And, you know, I just finished reading The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I'm not sure if you've read that, which...
I read that recently. It's incredible.
So incredible. Yeah. And I really think that, you know, both you and Bennett do this thing that I just completely admire, which is sort of poetically really subtly hinting along the way, but really withholding for the most part. And so it made me wonder, and especially, you know, like things like, when did you sort of decide to write part of the story from Elaine's perspective, but did you also already have Elaine's story, like the details of it in mind as you were going, or was that more editorial, or yeah?
So I wrote an entire first draft of Kokomo all from Mina's point of view. And I knew once I got to the end of it that something was missing, but I wasn't sure what it was yet. And the story was quite different. So there was always a secret and there was always a reason why Elaine hadn't left the house. But I just, when I wrote the first draft, I just knew I hadn't nailed it yet. And so I went to write the second draft and I got about halfway through and I just realized what it was that was missing, and it was Elaine's story. And I feel like once I started to write that, it came out so quickly and so easily that it's like it was fully formed in my head somewhere. I just hadn't realized it yet. And there were kind of parts of the timeline and the pacing of it which we played with in the editorial process, but the kind of structure of Mina, that was there from draft 2 onwards. And yeah, the kind of details of her story were all there from draft 2 onwards.
It must have been pretty satisfying to when the moment clicked and when you worked it out, I imagine.
It was satisfying after I started writing it, but I did have a day where I was like, oh God, I thought I was almost done with this draft, but actually I have another like 20,000 words or something to write. Oh God. And I just felt sorry for myself for a day. And then the next day I got back to work.
Well, I think those days of feeling sorry for yourself are crucial to process, right?
Essential. Yeah.
I wanted to also ask about the term millennial with you, because, you know, it's used to describe this book. And, you know, honestly, even when I'm describing it to customers in the shop, like, that is a word that I use because it kind of contextualizes it. But because it's been used as like this derogatory term for a while, and that's shifting, you know, it denotes a certain kind of humor. It denotes a certain kind of person who's living, I guess, with an awareness of the effects of like capitalism and the oppressiveness of that. But how do you feel about the word, and how do you feel about it being used in relation to your work?
At first I was like, oh, I'm almost like too old to be a millennial. Like, I'm just on the cusp of it. And so people describing me as a millennial writer, I'm like, well, I guess sort of, because my character is a bit younger and she's kind of fits into that age group. But I feel like in some ways it's helpful to sell a book and to help people kind of understand what it's about. But in other ways, I think it's a little reductive, because yes, it does tell the story of a young woman who is alive in, like, you know, 2017 or 18 or whatever year, I can't even remember when it's set. But there's also a whole section of it which tells Elaine's point of view, which kind of goes from the 80s until now. And so in that respect, it's multi-generational, and there's something in there for, I think, older women as well. And hopefully they will find that part of the story resonates with them too. So I understand the kind of use of the word, but I hope that it doesn't turn people off reading the book, because I think there is something in there for all age groups.
Absolutely. And like, even it being, you know, Mina as a protagonist there, like, her experiences, her feelings are, I think, are relatable beyond just what she gets categorized as. The other thing I was thinking about, though, with the term millennial is kind of, we're noticing, I guess, a pretty big surge in stories that show that friendship love is just as crucial, if not actually more so, than romantic love, which has sort of for so long been kind of this conditioning we have of the priority. And, you know, this is shown so beautifully in Kokomo as well, with the relationship between Mina and her best friend Kira. And yeah, I just was hoping that you could share with our viewers sort of your thoughts on friendship and friendship love and why it's important.
That was one of the things that I really wanted to portray in this book, was these really strong female bonds. And I agree that there is a kind of slew of novels coming out at the moment which explore this, and it makes me so happy. I have long said that my friends are the loves of my life, and a lot of them are the strongest and longest relationships that I've had. And I wrote this book for them, and as a kind of love letter to my friends. And I couldn't have done it without their support. And I'm going to cry.
Sorry.
No, and so I love that that's a takeaway that you got from it. And I really love that so many people have identified with that strong relationship between both Kira and Mina, but then also Elaine and Valerie, even though Elaine does sort of betray her in a secret way. But yeah, I just think that female friendships is one of the greatest gifts that I've had in my life, and I'm going to be exploring that probably in everything that I write for the rest of my life, because I think it's such rich territory. And like I said, it's just been one of the greatest things that has happened to me is my friends. And so yeah, I want them to star in every book that I write.
Yes, I love that so much. That's so beautiful.
So many of them are like, if this ever gets made into a film, can we be in it? And I was like, yeah, you can be extras in the background.
Well, I hope it does get made into a film. That'd be very cool.
Yeah, it has been optioned.
Really? Congratulations.
So, yeah, I don't think that
exciting.
has been announced at all. I haven't really talked about that yet. So exclusive for your viewers.
Woohoo! We're getting the inside scoop.
Yeah. So I mean,
first.
very early days, but the team who are working on it, I'm really excited by them and their passion and their vision for it. So fingers crossed.
Oh, how amazing. Yeah, this would be a great adapted to screen. That's really exciting. Oh, well, I guess that kind of takes me to my last question, which is always, again, another bit of a cliche, but
they're my favorite questions.
Yay. What are you working on, if anything, at the moment? Yeah.
So I am working on my next novel.
Yes.
I'm about halfway through my third draft. I have a looming deadline. I'm not confident that I'm going to meet it, but don't tell my agent or my publisher. I'm sort of like bogged. I'm kind of looking down because I have a printout of the manuscript right here, and it's just sort of taunting me. So I'm getting there. It's another story about grief. Mm-hmm. It is. Do you want to know more?
Yeah, I'd love to if we're allowed.
Sure. No one's told me I'm not allowed to talk about it, so I'm going to do it. It's the story about 5 friends who witness a tragic accident, and it looks at how the trauma of that and the grief of that kind of fracture their relationships.
Wow. Oh my gosh. That sounds wow. I'm very much looking forward to reading it.
Yeah, it's quite heavy, but I think, as with Kokomo, I'm kind of layering the heavy moments with the lighter moments because I don't know. I don't know if you've read A Little Life, but I'm so intrigued by how many people loved that book because I found it just too heavy and too traumatic, and I don't know how someone could sit down and write that and do that to their characters over and over again. So I always have to, I do mean things to my characters and like give them a really hard time, but then I like to layer in some jokes and layer in some lighter moments in there too, just for my own sake more than anything.
Absolutely. And I think that's maybe a bit closer to life as well. I mean, I was thinking about that in terms of a recent read of The Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree, which is sort of, I'm not sure if you've read it, but
No, I haven't.
It's an Iranian-Australian magic realist novel, but it's set just post-Iranian Revolution and centered on a family. So it's very like, it's kind of got a domesticity to it, but also fractured by this intense tragedy. But it's really funny. Like there are a lot of like light, laugh out loud kind of moments in it. And that just is like, the ability to do that just shows such a like breadth of, I guess, emotional awareness as well of what,
well, I think also I'm just not a very serious person. Like I take my work very seriously, but on the whole I'm kind of, I don't know, in my family I sort of take on the court jester role, where I'm always just like coming in kind of being like, okay, I'm going to distract you with a joke now, I'll do something silly. And so it's not, I don't think it's even possible for me to write sort of 70,000 words where there are no jokes. Like it's just really out of character for me. So it's just not, I don't think it would even be possible for me to write a novel that was completely serious.
Well, you know, I guess also like comedy and tragedy are 2 sides of the same coin as well, and they highlight different parts of it. So well, I'm very excited about your upcoming book, and I'm sure that despite deadlines, it's now 2021, everything's a bit more shifting sands, right? So good luck with it, and thank you so much for your time today and for all your incredible knowledge and thoughts and for writing this book.
Thank you so much for having me.
Such a pleasure.